Right, so according to a Korean source, we have information about a MacBook SE that could offer the power of the M1 at $700. Now that would be absolutely amazing, but I do have my doubts, and so let's delve into the report. But first, make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors, and with that being said, let's just tuck in. Right, so massive disclaimer to begin with, this source is not very reliable, so take the information with a massive grain of salt. But anyways, delving into the report, I do want to say it's been translated from Korean to English with Google Translate, and so things might be lost in translation, but basically what I'm understanding is that Apple could be developing a MacBook SE that won't be based on the 12-inch MacBook, weirdly enough, and should be under $700, offering the power of the M1, and it should also share components like the battery with the iPad. Now, the most interesting and surprising thing about this report is that the MacBook SE won't allegedly be based on the 12-inch MacBook. Now, this is pretty weird because it's been a common assumption that the 12-inch MacBook would be revived as a cheaper Apple Silicon MacBook, and this does make sense because the biggest issue with the 12-inch MacBook was the fact the Intel chips were just terrible and were not built for the thin, light, and fanless body of the 12-inch MacBook, which of course M1 is perfect for. So yes, Apple can repurpose and chuck in the M1 to the 12-inch MacBook, and it should theoretically be perfect. And so yes, it's interesting the Korean source does not think this will be the case, though to be honest, I can think of a few reasons as to why. Number one being a logistics reason. So of course, the 12-inch MacBook was discontinued all the way back in 2019, and so Apple has stopped making those MacBooks, and so I'm assuming it would be expensive to get those manufacturing tools and the resources for that design once again, because it's been quite a few years since they've manufactured that design. And that really goes against the concept of an SE model, because the whole point of an SE is not only to be cheap for the consumer, but also for Apple, because as we saw with the iPhone SE and the Apple Watch SE, Apple basically took designs that were still in production, the iPhone 8 and the Apple Watch Series 5 respectively, and just basically recycled them. And so if Apple were to make a MacBook SE, it makes sense for them to recycle a design that's currently in production, and so maybe Apple uses the 13-inch MacBook Air's design. This would make a ton of sense in my opinion, because Gurman has said Apple has plans of keeping the M1 MacBook Air around even after the introduction of the M2 model, and so maybe Apple repurposes the M1 MacBook Air and gives us a MacBook SE instead, much like Apple did with the Apple Watch SE, which was essentially, for the most part, last year's Apple Watch Series 5. And so yes, I think I've just convinced myself that this makes a lot more sense than a 12-inch MacBook revival, because obviously the 13-inch form factor is way more popular, and I think that 12 inches is just too small for a laptop nowadays. And so yes, I do think that if this does happen, Apple is going to recycle the 13-inch MacBook Air's design. Also, do remember the 12-inch design has components that Apple no longer uses, namely the butterfly keyboard and the terraced battery design, and so I don't think Apple wants to bring those back, especially the butterfly keyboard, since of course it's fair to say the butterfly keyboards weren't really well received. As for the M1 chip, that makes sense because we are going to see a new M2 MacBook Air that should be slightly more powerful with a 10-core GPU and of course a higher clock speed for the actual cores, and so M1 being the super cheap MacBook does make a ton of sense. And of course Apple can bring down the price to $700 for this MacBook SE by removing some features, so maybe it has a worse display than the current MacBook Air with less brightness and maybe no P3 color support, and maybe also the omission of Touch ID. But to be honest, even with those omissions, I still think the MacBook SE based on the 13-inch MacBook Air would be an incredible deal, because you cannot get the performance of the M1 for that kind of price on the Windows side. So now you may be wondering that everything right now seems perfect, so what's the issue? Why do you have mixed feelings on this report? Well, the next part is what's confusing because the source says this MacBook is going to be sharing components with the iPads, maybe even the actual batteries. Now that makes no sense to me. Why would Apple share the batteries between the iPad Pro, I'm assuming, and the MacBook SE? That does not make a ton of sense, since I'm assuming Apple can't put the larger batteries we have on the iPads in this MacBook design. So yeah, that's a pretty sus part about the report, but also, how does a source know it's going to be the MacBook SE? Because we don't get to know about marketing names till much closer to release. For example, no one still knows whether the iPhones this year will be the iPhone 12s or iPhone 13, and so for this source to know the name this early is again really suspicious, and it could be a possible red flag that this tidbit is not true. Also, I do want to mention the price is too good to be true. $700 for a base MacBook would be amazing, but how would Apple get you to buy the M2 MacBook Air? Because let's assume the new MacBook Air is $1,100. That means there could be a $400 price gap between both models, and surely people are going to go for the MacBook SE because you're saving $400 and you're still getting a terrific MacBook with the power of M1. And so in my opinion, if we do ever see this MacBook, it's going to be $899 instead of $699 because that just seems way more realistic, and a $200 price gap actually makes the M2 MacBook Air somewhat worth it with the new design, mini LED, and of course the M2. But finally, my other concern with the MacBook SE is the fact it might cannibalize the iPad Pro. Because think about it, why would you buy an $800 iPad over a $700 MacBook? Now yes, I know some prefer the iPad Pro's form factor, but of course, that has iPad OS, and we know how restricted the iPad is because of the software, and so the $700 MacBook SE would be the better deal because you would be getting macOS, which is way more powerful. And well, much like the iPad Pro not getting Pro apps, I don't think Apple's going to make a $700 MacBook because they want people to buy both. They want people to buy an iPad and a Mac, not just one, and so I think Apple wants to keep both categories separate, and a $700 MacBook could ruin that. And yes, I'm aware the iPad Pro has Apple Pencil support, or of course a touchscreen unlike the Mac, but those features are also available on the iPad Air, so yes, I think the $700 MacBook could make the iPad Pro obsolete. And so yes, my conclusion is this: I want this laptop, this would be amazing, but I'm unsure Apple's ever going to do this. If we ever do see a cheaper MacBook, it might be $900, but definitely not $700 in my opinion. In fact, it's probably more likely that Apple takes the lazy route and just lowers the price of the M1 Air to $900. But let me know your thoughts on this potential MacBook SE. Anyways, thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. Check out the video in the icon above on details regarding the M2 iPad Pro. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps.